Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and our merch and partner products. We have a live show coming up soon, so please do check it out at nothingmuchhappens.com. Sticks head out into world. Eek! My dears, it is so easy to feel overwhelmed right now. As a yoga teacher, I used to say, in times like these, it's important to remember that there have always been times like these. But I sort of stopped saying that because it does feel like every day is its own new, original kind of scary. And our brains just weren't designed to handle all the information that comes our way, and certainly not to process it alone, as we often are, just scrolling through our phones. All this to say, that is why this show exists. You still need joy and calm and peace, and recharging you with those things makes you resilient and strong. So come with me into the Village of Nothing Much, where kindness is commonplace and everyone has what they need. And come back again as often as you like to recharge and reclaim some joy. And before we start, just because I think it'll feel good, take a nice deep breath in through your nose and sigh from your mouth. One more, breathe in. Let it out. Good. In the library. Those first few steps into the library always surprise me. I forget, when it's been a while, how quiet and cool it is. How the scent of the books, dusty and sweet, rushes up at you as soon as you open the door. And how keenly inviting the sight of all those books are. Even if I'm just stepping in to return my recent reads, I find I can't help but walk through the stacks for a few minutes and admire the quiet order of the reading rooms. Today, I was here for more than just a few minutes, so I took my time. It was my day off, and I'd gotten up early just to make a cup of coffee and crawl back into bed with it. I'd opened the shades in my bedroom and lounged with my cup, looking out at the changing light for a while. I listened to my kitty purring on the blanket beside me. She was lazily looking out the window too, and every now and then her tail would flick suddenly, and then like a wisp of smoke from a blown-out candle, it would curl and slowly settle back to the bed. I wondered what made that flick happen. What were her kitty thoughts stirred by? I laid a hand on her back and felt the soothing thrum of her purr. I smiled to myself as I made plans for the day. We were only in the first cool days of autumn, leaves just beginning to shift and fall. The nights were getting colder, but by midday, the sun warmed the air, and it was comfortable. Actually, it was really pleasant to wear a sweater and feel the sun on your back and the cool air on your face. So I decided to walk to town and spend some time in the stacks at the library. I slung a bag with a few necessities across my body and tied my shoes and stepped out to breathe in the mid-morning air. I saw a few people walking dogs or bringing in groceries as I made my way through the neighborhood streets and closer to town. It was a little city. Really, just a few major streets and side alleys. But we had a couple nice cafes, an old cinema with a pretty marquee where they always showed one old movie along with the new ones, a big green park in the center of town, and a really good library. I got there just a few minutes after they opened, but there were already a few bikes parked at the rack and a steady stream of patrons coming and going, some with children hanging from each hand, others with serious-looking book bags, laptops peeking out ready to get to work, and some, like me, just looking to be close to books and curious to see what I might find. I slid in through the glass doors and took a moment to look around. I could head straight into the stacks, or take the scenic route, through the children's section. I picked scenic and took a few minutes to wander past the big storybooks and tiny chairs. I smiled at a dad sitting in the middle of an aisle with his daughter on his lap as he read, and nodded at the librarians as they reshelved books and tidied up the desk. In one of the main rooms, there were neat rows of tables, broad, empty workspaces with identical reading lamps, old chairs, and wastebaskets. I loved the sameness repeating through the space. It made me feel calm and focused. I found a spot for myself, set my book down, and took a thermos of tea from it to set out on the desktop. Then I looked around at the rows of books and started to wander the aisles. I let my eyes move over the titles. Like any reader, I have my favorites, but I always browsed in unfamiliar sections. That is one of the really exciting things about being surrounded by so many books. They're all around you, and you can just pull them down and start reading, and you never know when or where you will find the one that opens you up and makes you wonder or laugh or cry or just live differently after. I'd only planned to get a book or two, but after an hour of browsing and sampling, I had 5. I sat for a few minutes back at the neat desks, sipping tea and skimming pages, deciding which one I would start first, when my stomach gave a low, warning rumble. I thought about staying put a bit longer, but since one of the only things more enjoyable than reading a new book is reading a new book while you eat a sandwich, I decided to check out my armful of fresh picks and go. In the park, there's a kiosk that sells ice cream and coffee and sandwiches and cold drinks. I queued up with some office workers on their break and waited my turn to order, the one with lots of pickles on it, please. They wrapped it up in brown paper for me, gave me an apple as well, and sent me on my way. I settled onto a bench in a quiet corner of the park, unwrapped my sandwich, and noticed the cool autumn air around me. I've always thought that each season had its own best kind of leisurely pursuit. Winter was for movies. Spring was for poetry. Summer was for music, and autumn is for books. I thought about the books I'd checked out. I'd got myself a book about the cosmos and concepts that I'd always wanted to understand but never had. A mystery set in an English country house, a memoir, a novel that I'd picked up just because I liked the cover, and a book about what might have happened if lots of things in Earth's history had gone differently. I thumbed through the book with a pretty cover. It had unexpectedly beautiful illustrations and engravings throughout. I read a bit, then shifted to the memoir for a moment, noticing where a few pages had been folded over by a previous reader. I knew I was going to go straight for the country house mystery and hope that the butler hadn't done it, but I pretended for a few more minutes that I might finally read about the multiverses and the string theories. Then, brushing the crumbs off my lap, I opened my new book and started to read. The Lookout. It wasn't exactly a secret. I'm sure lots of people found this spot over the years. But it was a little off the path, and there were no signs or guideposts to point it out. The first time I found it, I'd been chasing after Juneberries. It was early summer, and I knew they must be growing wild somewhere in the woods where I like to hike. I'd been keeping an eye out for fallen white petals in the undergrowth when I spotted some and diverged from my usual route. Juneberry trees bloomed full of whitish flowers in April and May, and as the petals fell, the berries ripened. I'd had a good look in my foraging guide before I'd left the house to be sure I could recognize the shrub and the berry, and had been tickled by all the names for this fruit. It was a Juneberry, but also a serviceberry, or a sarviceberry, a saskatoon, a sugar plum, a chuckly pear, a sugar pea, or a maycherry. They all sounded tasty, and they were. I'd found a thicket full of ripe berries and stood for a few minutes, just eating right off the vine. They had a good sweet flavor that did remind me a bit of cherries, or even raisins, and as I picked more and circled around the tree, something caught my eye in the distance. I walked, still popping berries into my mouth, deeper into the woods, drawn by a shaft of sunlight cutting through the branches. I saw stone steps, half covered in pine needles, that rose up and wrapped around a platform sitting high in the branches. I gingerly tested out the steps, finding them solid and firmly cemented into place, and chewing the last of my saskatoons, carefully climbed all the way up. It was just an open, flat space the size of a couple parking spots, though I suspected there had once been a little wooden structure sat upon it. For the most part, all I could see were branches and the bright green spring leaves that had just fully unfurled. Then I turned in a slow circle and saw that on one side the land sloped away, and the trees with it, and I could see clear across the horizon, over the dip of a valley and the hills on either side. It was a lookout, and maybe once had served to keep watch for fires or track migrations. Thus the small shelter whose marks were still visible in the concrete floor. I thought it had been built when the surrounding trees were less mature, and likely had a 360-degree view once, but now it was sheltered, and I liked that even better. That day, I'd gone back to fill a handkerchief with maycherries and sat with my legs dangling over the edge of the platform, eating them slowly, looking out at the tens of thousands of trees and all the green and listening to birds calling. I'd been careful to notice on the way back any small landmarks that would help me find it again, and by now, I knew the way well. I'd been there a few times over the summer, but was especially looking forward to the view in autumn. I'd been keeping watch on the trees in my neighborhood and while I was out on drives, waiting for the peak color moment, and it had finally come. On my way to the trailhead, I'd stopped to let a couple dozen cyclists cross the dirt road in front of me, and I thought about how fresh that must feel, the cool air and the thrill of the small hills and all the sights they would see before winding up their ride. When my car was parked and I'd snugly tied my hiking boots, I stepped out onto the trail. It was a funny thing. I did this all the time, here or on other trails or the path in the park downtown. Most days I walked for my exercise, my meditation, my own pleasure. But still, every time I set off, I was excited. Every time felt like an adventure. There was already a thin layer of fallen, dried leaves on the path, and they crunched under my boots. I dressed for a cool day, but just with a long-sleeve flannel and jeans, a thin beanie pulled over my ears. My rule of thumb was that if I was fully warm and comfortable when I started to hike, then I'd be overheated before the end. So I took it as a good sign that the air nipped at me a little as I walked. I followed the trail until I spotted a giant rock that had somehow been split in two. It was a boulder, in fact, as boulder is, somewhat surprisingly, a scientific designation, and a rock must be at least 16 inches in diameter to earn it. And even split in two, this one was. From there, I turned into the woods and made my own path. We'd had rain the week before, and the ground was springy and covered in moss. A little further on there was a tree with a branch about 5 feet overhead that grew straight out to the side on a 90-degree angle. What fun that must have been to climb when it was smaller. I turned again, and after a few paces found the juneberry tree that had fed me in the spring. Beyond it was the lookout. The steps still half covered in pine needles, and still sturdy as I cautiously climbed. At the top step, I found a bright red maple leaf, pinned down with a pretty green stone. And I thought that was likely a sort of hello from whoever else had climbed here. And while I was glad the spot was gently enjoyed, I was twice as glad to have it to myself today. I thought of that box that had been checked sometimes on my quarterly report cards in elementary school. The one that said, "Plays well with others." I did, but they should also have had a box for "Plays well alone," because that is important too. I turned to the view and smiled wide, taking it in. Miles of trees in a rainbow of autumn colors spread out in every direction. The air was cold and incredibly fresh, and as I sat, I pulled breaths of it in as if I could keep some for later. Squirrels were running through the branches around me, and I noticed a pile of acorn shells heaped in a corner of the platform. I wondered what this view would look like in midwinter, when all the branches were bare and the land coated in snow. It would be another adventure. The Leaf House. On a back corner on the property, built by the generation before, was a small tool shed that housed the lawnmower and the rakes and snow shovels, but looked a bit like a child's playhouse. It must have been built by someone who was as much artist as craftsperson, because it clearly hadn't come in a kit in which you slip tab B into slot L. It was made with planks of slightly mismatched wood that had been skillfully put together, like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle. It had windows on either side of the single door, with individual panes of glass fitted into hand-smoothed glazing, and a peaked roof with a decorative barge board of twisting curlicues. In the spring, I'd repainted it, its usual shade of sunny yellow, and in the summer, I'd filled its small window boxes with bright pink impatiens. Yesterday, I'd cleared them out, setting a few small round pumpkins in their place, and hung baskets of purple mums from hooks in the overhanging roof. When I stepped up to open its door today, the sunlight caught on a thin strand of spider web that stretched from the edge of the pot of flowers down to the stem of one of the pumpkins. I got lost just looking at it for a moment, marveling at the way the light bounced on the silk strand. I thought of the resourceful spider, finding these new placed offerings and wasting no time in setting up house. It was a cool morning, not cold, but not far from it. And as I pulled open the creaking shed door, I could see my breath in the air. No matter, I thought. Soon enough I'd be warmed through with work. Inside the shed, I shifted aside the long-handled spades and trowels that had been center stage in the spring and summer, and dug out a rake for today's work. I found a well-worn pair of garden gloves and stepped out into the air to clap them together a few times, knocking out dirt and dust. The trees were dropping leaves in a slow-motion Technicolor downpour. They still had plenty left to drop, and today was just a part of the autumn chores, but I didn't mind it a bit. I was happy to have a job to do, and a sunny day to do it on. Some work is hard to gauge. You can spend hours toiling, and when you step back to look at what you've done, find it difficult to mark any progress. But this kind of work, raking leaves, clearing flower beds, I knew that when I put my tools away at the end of the day, I could look across the yard and see a job well done. I carried my rake to a spot under a tall maple, whose leaves were a deep, rusty red. I started to rake, pulling layers of leaves this way and that, and making tall, dry piles that smelled musky sweet and earthy as the sun shone on them. I worked away, taking breaks now and then, to press my hands into the small of my back and take a stretch, or to drink from the mason jar I'd set out on the stone path in front of the shed. I raked the leaves onto tarps and pulled them over to spread onto my vegetable garden. Later, I'd mulch them into the soil. They'd break down over the next several months, making compost for next year's planting. From the maple, I worked my way over to the row of oak trees that stood along one side of the yard. These leaves were narrow, and most were a bright electric yellow, though some were tipped with red, and others were the pale, dry brown of school lunch bags. I thought of a game we'd played as children. What had we called it? I nodded into the memory as I gathered the leaves to me. We'd called it Leaf House. I'm sure we'd been assigned the chore of raking leaves, but had turned it into a game, which, likely to my parents' consternation, hadn't cleared the yard at all, but had merely spread the leaves more artistically over the grass. We'd each stake a claim on some section of the yard and use our rakes to draw out a street that connected them. Then we'd rake away, drawing out the shape of our houses. Mine always had long corridors, with a dozen rooms leading off them. Here was the kitchen, and I'd scrape a pile of leaves together to be the table. Here was the bedroom, and I'd make a path around the bed. After we'd finished staking out the spaces, we'd go visiting. One of us would stand on the front doorstep of another's house and knock their hand against the bare air, thumping their foot against the ground or calling out, "Knock, knock, knock." Then the other would put down their book of leaves and wind their way to the door, wondering loudly, "Now who could that be?" At some point, we'd scrap the designs and build something else, a school, a grocery store, an amusement park, the game requiring more imagination as it went, but we kept up just fine. It most certainly ended with us all banding together to build the tallest pile of leaves we could, then taking running jumps into them and scattering them back out in every direction. My own piles were finally and mostly shifted over to the garden. In another week or two, I'd have the whole thing to do all over again. I took my rake and gloves back to the shed and sat down on the stepping stones to drink a bit more water. I thought of the little shed, built to look like a tiny home, of the spider setting up housekeeping among the mums and pumpkins, and us as kids scraping away the leaves to make bedrooms. It's the first thing we play at, making homes, then something we repeat over and over. I leaned back on my hands and looked out over the cleared yard. The grass, for now, was still green. The leaves were spread out over the bare soil, and I thought of the insects who were probably, right now, burrowing down under them. The birds who'd be making V's in the sky as the days got colder, and the deer out somewhere beyond my sight, readying for the winter. All of us pulled by the same instinct. All of us busy making a home. These were some relaxing stories to walk back through. That first one, At the Library, is from way back in season 2, and I remember being very excited to write a fall-themed story. Since Nothing Much Happens launched in the spring of 2018, I had to wait months and months to write cozy season stories. It was torture. This episode is also one of the first to describe the village of Nothing Much as far as streets, businesses downtown, and its general geography. That my stories began to overlap and take place in what was clearly becoming a shared universe wasn't something I'd originally set out to do. It just sort of happened organically. And it is something I know lots of listeners love about the shows. We kind of all want to move into our own little Christmas village or dollhouse. And to let you in on a little behind-the-scenes coming attraction information, we are working right now on a very big way to help you do just that. I mean, it doesn't involve shrink rays or anybody relocating, but we are building out a virtual village that you'll be able to spend time and meet friends in. Be sure to follow us on our socials so you don't miss out on it. People still ask me, what sandwich has all the pickles on it? And I'm pretty sure I had been thinking of a falafel sandwich when I wrote that. Because, to be honest, I'm thinking about falafel sandwiches most of the time. In Michigan, we are lucky enough to be the home of one of the largest Arab American communities in the U.S., and the resulting food scene is unmatched. Around these parts, our gas station baba ganoush is often better than anything you can get in a fancy sit-down joint somewhere else. I don't think I would have made it through college without falafel sandwiches. As a vegan, they were perfect, absolutely delicious and filling and less expensive than fast food. Have I inspired you to go see what your own falafel scene is like? I hope so. Next, we took a hike out to the lookout. The story was inspired by a few videos I watched of people moving into lookout houses for the fire season. I think being a lookout keeper has the same energy as being a lighthouse keeper. There's a feeling of peace in purpose and solitude there that we probably over-romanticize, but still seems really lovely. There is a little Easter egg in this episode. You see the group of bicyclists from the story called Autumn Ride as they sort of ride through the middle of the story. And that story can be heard, by the way, in episode 42 of this podcast. The bit about the scientific definition of a boulder was inspired by an episode of the Ologies podcast. I forget which one now, but if you love deep diving on interesting topics with people who really love explaining them, head over there after this. That's Ologies with Allie Ward. Finally, we played around at the Leaf House in our last story today. This was absolutely something I did as a kid. All my neighborhood friends did it, across the connected front yards of several houses. In the story, I reflect on this instinct to make homes and sketch out communities, and as I read back through it, I thought, that's what I'm doing with my podcasts. I've always been trying to build a place for us to meet up. So, thanks for coming along, for being my neighbor. Until next week, I hope you find a great new read, that you get some time outside to enjoy the fresh air, and that you feel at home wherever you are, as well as here with me.